Well, good afternoon. I'm happy you're here in our last session. Um, it is a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Sir Robert Watson. He is the former chair of the Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. Dr. Watson has also chaired and co-chaired a number of other influential scientific assessments, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. We have invited him here to discuss the findings of the IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, discussed and agreed by the 132 IPBES member governments last May in Paris. In the next 30 minutes or so, he will show us how biodiversity is being lost at a historic rate, 100 to 1,000 times faster than evolutionary loss, and how it is undermining the ability of most countries to achieve most of the sustainable development goals, in particular food, water, and human security. After his keynote presentation, we will take your questions, so please line up at the sides so you can get a chance to ask a question. Please welcome him with me.
Thank you. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I will go very quickly over some slides because we have less time than I originally thought. Anyway, the key is this. The bottom line of my talk, if you listen to nothing else, both human-induced climate change and loss of biodiversity are undermining human well-being. They need to be addressed together, and they need to be addressed now. Unfortunately, actions by governments and the private sector are totally inadequate to meet the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 and 2 degree targets, and we are neither meeting the Aichi biodiversity targets. Both of these issues undermine human well-being and undermine the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These two issues are not only environmental issues, they're development issues, economic issues, security issues, moral issues, and ethical issues. We need transformative change. Cost-effective and socially acceptable response options are available. There's no question that nature underpins and sustains our quality of life. We've been producing more food, more energy, more materials than ever before, and we're supplying it to people throughout the world. Unfortunately, while we do this, we're destroying nature's regulating services and non-material contributions. It's undermining the ability to nature to regulate climate, regulate pollution, floods, droughts, diseases. It takes away from the social experience of walking through a nice quiet forest by a river. What we see here is our 18 different services we looked at, and only 3 are going up. We're producing more food on land, but less in the oceans, more energy and more materials. But as I've just said, we're undermining all of our regulatory systems and all of our social experience. So fundamentally, in our quest, which we must meet to feed the needs of the world for food, water, and energy, we are really destroying biodiversity. We've already converted 75% of the land around the world, the non-ice land, and by 2050, probably 90%. Land degradation already affects 3.2 billion people, nearly half the world's population. 66% of the ocean is already in trouble, and we've effectively already lost 87% of wetlands that are crucial for migratory birds, for water purification. And effectively, we will continue to lose biodiversity between now and 2050 unless we get truly serious about it. This simply shows what we call the IUCN ability to try and look at species. To what degree are they critically endangered in red? Are they endangered in orange? And are they vulnerable to future change in yellow? And so for different species, there are different levels of threat. What it boils down to analyze is, of all the species looked at, about 25% of all animal and plants are threatened with extinction. We deduce there is about 8.1 million species on Earth today. 5 million insects, 3 million plants and animals. We assume 25% of animals and plants are threatened, 10% of insects. So we came up with a conclusion, 1 million species are threatened with extinction. But they don't need to go extinct. We can effectively manage our ecosystems in a way we can save most of those 1 million species, but not if we continue the way we do today. Clearly, as you actually heard from the presenter, we're effectively destroying biodiversity at tens to hundreds of times faster than natural evolution. And this has shown what's happened literally over the last 500 years to amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish. And as you can see, the rate of extinction, especially in the last 100 years, has gone up tremendously. However, many people argue we're in the middle of a mass extinction, the middle of the sixth mass extinction. We're not. When there was a mass extinction, we lost 75% of all animals, plants, and species. Today, we've only lost 2%. That's still very serious, but we should not say it's a sixth mass extinction yet, caused by us humans. But not only are we losing wild species, we're also losing domesticated plants and animals. Decreased sharply. We're relying on a few foods, a few genetic varieties. So it's not only wild species that are a threat, it's also our domesticated species. So effectively, what's the bottom line? The drivers of change have been accelerating over the last 50 years. Well, what are they? They're land use change. There's exploitation on land and in the oceans, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. On land, the terrestrial biosphere, the biggest threat is land use. We've converted our forests, our mangrove swamps, our grasslands to agriculture and to timber. In the oceans, we've overexploited our fisheries. Climate change is probably the third most important driver, not the first at the moment. Why are we driving this? And I'll come back to climate change in a second. We're getting more and more people, demographic change. We're getting a richer world, thank goodness. Therefore, people have more ability to purchase. Therefore, per capita consumptions are going up. And they're driving those direct drivers. The way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we produce medicines, etc. So climate change and biodiversity. While it has not been the dominant driver, it's projected to become as important or more important in the coming decades. Therefore, it's crucial to try and meet the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 Celsius target or the 2-degree target. So how well are we doing? Badly. The answer is, if you can see the baseline, that's the trajectory we're on for emissions of greenhouse gases. The blue line is the one that takes us to 2 degrees Celsius, way below it. For 1.5, you even have to be below that 2-degree line. So where are we? And I'm just going to quickly show you this. Fundamentally, even if all the Paris pledges are met, we end up sort of still only halfway down to emissions reductions needed for a 2-degree world, and we're nowhere close to what we need to reduce greenhouse gases for a 1.5-degree world. So that's the gap for a 2-degree world. So the Paris Agreement is very important, no question. The pledges are very important. But to be honest, the current pledges are totally and utterly inadequate, and many of the countries today are not even meeting their current pledges. If we continue on with the current pledges, even if they're all met, we'll pass the 1.5 aspirational target by probably the early to mid-2030s, and we'll pass the 2-degree target between 2050 and 2070. With no additional actions, we're on a pathway to a 3 to 4 degree world. So going back to biodiversity, that's why I'm so worried about climate change as a major threat to biodiversity. And changes in biodiversity can also affect climate change. One thing I learned, and it's important, the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities, unbelievably important. They have incredible knowledge, innovation, practices, and institution. We need to learn from them. They manage their land much better than we in the rest of the world. In fact, they actually occupy 25% of global land. 35% of our ecosystems and protected areas are in lands of indigenous people and local communities. They lead the way in thinking about agrobiodiversity. Nature is decreasing less fast on their own land, but it is still decreasing on the land of indigenous people and local communities, and it's because they're under pressure. You see in Brazil, the Amazon may be further exploited with the new options of the president. And so even the indigenous people's land is under threat. So what about the 20 Aichi targets? Beautifully negotiated 10 years ago in Japan. Excellent targets, in my opinion. And what about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which in my opinion are all equally excellent? Things like food security, water security, human health, gender, leave nobody behind. Absolutely excellent Sustainable Development Goals. Well, what's our progress towards the Aichi targets in the 10 years or the 9 years since they were negotiated in Japan? Poor. As you can see, most of them are poor. There are a few that are moderately successful. In other words, we're going in the right direction, but we won't succeed. And there's a few that are good. And one of them that we say is good are the protected areas and conserved land. But most biodiversity is not in those protected areas. Most or many of those protected areas are badly managed, and none of them take into account that the Earth's climate is changing, and therefore the boundaries of these ecosystems are changing. So clearly, we've got some good targets, but we're failing to meet them. And next year in China, governments will talk about how do we become even more ambitious to protect biodiversity, and the problem is we're not even doing a good job on the targets we've already got. Well, what about the UN Sustainable Development Goals? We've done a really careful analysis. What's happening to nature and biodiversity? How will it affect poverty, hunger? How will it affect health, clean water? And as you can see, the direction we're going with biodiversity will give very little support and actually will undermine our ability to meet the poverty goal, the hunger goal, etc. There's some partial support, but in general, if we don't get to address climate change and biodiversity together, we will not achieve any of these sustainable development goals. And this came from our land degradation project, and it said how important was restoring our land and halting land degradation. And it's incredibly important for the goals on water, consumption, climate, hunger, poverty, and cities. Really important. So the issue isn't just loss of biodiversity. The issue is also land degradation in general. So we said, well, we know what's happening now and what's happened in the past. What about the future? Where are we headed? So we developed, along IPCC and climate change, these so-called socio-economic pathways. We looked at economic optimism, rapid technology development, high demand for goods and services, high economic growth and low population, regional competition, and you can read it quicker than I can read it, global sustainability and inequality. And then we have one middle of the road, almost business as usual. So what do these futures look like? Not good for biodiversity. All of them, even including global sustainability, is not good. We're going to lose species richness. We're going to lose it at the local level, the regional level, and even the global level. And our ecosystems will lose their intactness, the way they're all held together. There's no question the global sustainability, lower population growth, really thinking about sustainable agriculture is much, much better, but it's still not even perfect. Therefore, literally all of our scenarios show that biodiversity will continue to be lost, even with some of the better policies. We also looked effectively at some of these so-called ecosystem services. And as you can see, we will have more bioenergy, we can have more food, we can have much more timber. But the regulating services at the top here are largely going to be lost. So we really have to think, what future do we want? What do we mean by good human well-being? How can we produce the food we want, the energy I want, without a significant loss of biodiversity, species, and other services? So clearly, we need rapid implementation of our existing instruments. We've got some excellent policies, technologies around the world and practices. We need bold decisions for transformative change. both in government, the private sector, us as individuals. We've got the knowledge and the tools. We simply need better deployment and implementation, basically. And so there are many things that are good happening in many sectors, but they're not at the scale we need, and they need to be improved quite drastically. What we looked at is, boy, what can we do? Well, there effectively there's some major interventions, or what we call levers for change. As you can see, what you can do is there are incentives. There's cross-sectoral cooperation, preemptive action, decision-making that recognizes resilience and uncertainty, and law. Then there's leverage points. We're not going to go through them. We can reduce inequalities, internalize so-called externalities, recognize telecoupling. And if we can do these levers and leverage points, we can affect both the indirect drivers of change and the direct drivers for change. And so what are the challenges related to climate change? As I've already said, we need to look at climate change, deterioration of nature, and all of the elements of a good quality of life together, because they're all interconnected. There are synergies, but there are also trade-offs. So if we do reforestation with native species, the species that used to be there and grew naturally, restoration of degraded ecosystems, also with natural native vegetation, that's good. It's a win for climate, a win for biodiversity, and a win for society. But if we go to large-scale afforestation and bioenergy, especially if we use monocultures and we do it at the expense of natural forests, natural grasslands, wetlands, mangrove systems, we will actually lose biodiversity and also threaten food security and water security. So what do we need to do? We need to look at our governance structures. We need everybody involved. We need governments. We need the private sector. We need civil society. And we need trust. We have to trust and all work in the same direction. And we need indigenous people and local community, IPLCs. We need an evolution in our economic systems, an evolution that is complementary, not replacing gross domestic product, and I'll come back to that. We need a more equitable world, but recognize what are the inequities today. We need cross-sectoral planning, and I'll come back to that. We can't look at agriculture in isolation of water or energy or transportation. We need to provide short-term incentives for getting sustainable production and consumption in place. And we have to think about the social narratives. Is the definition of a good quality of life a bigger car, a bigger house, more travel, etc.? For many people, yes. But is that the right narrative? Can we do with a more sustainable world, a reasonable size house, a reasonable car, etc.? So we need to talk to society about what is the definition of a good quality of life. So we need cross-sectoral planning, integrated management. We need to look at our food production system, and we need agroecological practices, reduce food waste, integrate biodiversity concerns in all agricultural practices. We need much more integrated management of our oceans. We're overfishing the oceans everywhere in the world. In fact, most of the oceans are all overexploited. And while aquaculture can help, it is not the solution to inappropriate and unsustainable fisheries, basically. And we need nature-based solutions in cities as well. So what do I mean by an evolution of our economic system? I'm not saying replace capitalism. That would be inappropriate. It's not going to happen. Capitalism is here to stay. But a lot of social scientists would say we've got to find a different system to capitalism. What we're saying is we need to recognize that nature has value, economic value and social value, and we need to take these capitals into account in our national accounting system, complementary to GDP. We need to recognize that it's market value, what we buy and sell in the market, non-market value. In other words, we don't pay for pollination services or pollution services or flood control directly. We need to recognize that those services have economic value when we make decisions. And of course, there's societal value, where you can't put a pound sign or a dollar sign or a euro sign on it. We need to eliminate agricultural subsidies, energy subsidies, and transportation subsidies that hurt the environment. They're normally bad for the environment, and they rarely help poor people anyway. We need, as I've already said, incentives for sustainable production and we need to internalize in the price all of the externalities, social and environment. Now, I'm not going to go through these slides. I just wanted to show you there are some success stories. Lots of eco-certification programs in Latin America on forests, on coffee, soybeans and fisheries. There's a whole bunch of transboundary conservation projects in Asia Pacific. And so many of these issues go beyond national boundaries. I'm showing this only, if you're interested in success stories, they're all there in the IPBES documents. There's lots of good restoration and conservation efforts. Just giving a few examples in Europe and Central Asia. Lots of good protected areas in many parts of the world. Just mention a couple in Africa. And land degradation and restoration. Really good projects in India, good projects in South Africa, etc. All of this information is there. And then there's many other stories that we can share. They're all documented in our IPBES thing. We can also note that the net rate of loss of forest has gone down, although we are still losing major forests in parts of Africa, Asia, and in the Amazon basin. Many of the practices of indigenous people are now starting to have an effect more globally, basically, and we've slowed down, but not eliminated, the conversion of our temperate grasslands. So there are indeed success stories, but we need to scale them up. We need to understand what works and why, what fails and why, and are they replicable in different parts of the world? But we've got some ways to move forward. The last comment, and I've given this talk at least twice as fast as I normally do, so there is some time for comments and questions. I've already said it. Loss of biodiversity, like human-induced climate change, is an inter- and intra-generational equity issue. The poor of today and future generations are the most vulnerable, but we are all vulnerable to one extent or another. Luckily, the youth are finally speaking out. It's their future we're destroying. And so there's these campaigns around the world. The Voice for the Planet, Young Global Shakers. They announced this basically at the World Economic Forum this year in Davos. So David Attenborough actually led the charge basically. And it calls for a new deal for nature and people in 2020. How do we halt and reverse humanity's impact on nature and protect the planet? I would actually ask all of you to go to that website, sign up and make a personal commitment. I got all of the scientists that met in Paris to do exactly that, and we had a nice photo op showing all of us want to make a commitment. And they're things we should do, and they're logical, basically. So in conclusion, the trends, loss of species, degradation of ecosystems, business as usual is clearly unsustainable. The call for action is transformative change. Tackle the direct and indirect drivers of change, of both biodiversity, address climate change at the same time, scale up and replicate those success stories I've mentioned to you. Make sure that we don't look at agriculture separately from energy, water, transportation, even tourism. Bring them all together. Evolve and transform our economic and financial systems and ensure everybody's involved in decision making. Governments, private sector, civil society and IPLCs. If you're interested in our global assessment, it's all on our website now. My presentation is completely open. Hopefully it's put on the website. All of you can use this presentation, and this is the way. If you go to the website, all of our documents are on the website for your consideration. Thank you very much.
You did accomplish this in a record time. Thank you so much. Thank you for so much interesting information. First of all, I wanted to ask you, how has this assessment been received?
Yeah, this assessment has been received in an incredible way. You guys, the media, have done a brilliant job of making sure probably almost every individual in the world has learned about this. We've had more media coverage in the classical media, social media, online press than even the IPCC reports. It's been a phenomenal success. But more than that, it's also being taken up very much by large audiences. Anne Larragordy, who is the Executive Secretary, she and I were invited to the G7 Environment Ministers meeting in Metz. There were also 12 other ministers there, so we presented to 12. Extremely well received, and they all got the right message. Climate change and biodiversity have to be managed together, and they're both equity issues. They understood the importance of equity. I've already given 2 meetings in Congress, in the US Congress, and I've got another one in the Senate coming up in a few weeks. Some of my colleagues have also been involved in the French Parliament, the German Parliament. Several of us met President Macron of France for an hour, and more than an hour. So it's starting to be taken up. I've got dozens of invitations to talk all over the world, so have my colleagues.
That's great. If you had only one thing that you could do to reverse this, which one would it be, if you could only do one?
I would get rid of all the perverse subsidies in agriculture, energy, and transportation.
Okay. Do you... if people have questions, I would ask you to line up behind the microphone so we can give the word to you. But while people come along, when we think of these subjects, these huge subjects, we think of governments as being the ones that have to do the work. Is it only governments, or do you feel that the solutions are more in people and local governments? And
it's everybody. In fact, some of the private sector are far ahead of governments. There are some private sector companies, multinationals, that really do care about sustainability. They care about it from a social perspective and an environmental perspective. And the fact that if we destroy nature or keep changing climate, their business will go out of business, basically. So we need everyone. We as individuals can all help. We can conserve our water, our food, our energy, and not waste. We can let, as individuals, governments, and the private sector know we care about these issues and we want appropriate responses. So government can actually stimulate research, so can the private sector. They can stimulate new appropriate policies, but we all need to work together if we're going to have success.
Okay. Over here.
Palab Ghosh from BBC News. First of all, Bob, thank you very much for your time. As you said, you've got presidents and prime ministers to meet, so we're really appreciative of your time. But also, thank you for everything you're doing to try and make this work. You're a tour de force, and if anyone can turn it round, you can. What I wanted to ask you is whether you think it can be turned round, because you presented such a scenario. There's a lot of work to be done in such a short space of time, and we have world leaders in the US, in Brazil, in the UK it's slightly better, but and have you got the political commitment, the money you need to make that turnaround in such a short space of time?
The answer is I've got hope, but no, there is not the money. We've promised, we, the developed world, have promised developing countries $100 billion a year to address climate change. We need a comparable sort of number to address some of the issues of biodiversity loss and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You've pointed out in certain countries of the world, Brazil, Australia, the US, is there real hope there? We have to keep hope. I mean, I hope we're not like the lemmings. They run to the edge of the cliff and they all jump off. I think hopefully humans are a bit more sensible. We may go to the edge of the cliff and we may continue to lose some change climate, lose biodiversity, but hopefully we will see that the future of this and future generations does need transformative change. We can make those changes, they can be cost effective, and they can be socially acceptable. But we've all got to keep talking about it. We in the science community can keep presenting the data. You guys in journalism are absolutely crucial to make sure the public, the governments, and the private sector, you need to help keep pressure on them. So I'm mildly optimistic we will not stop climate change, we can limit it, we will not stop biodiversity loss, but I hope we can limit it to something that's more manageable.
A follow-up, if I may. Specifically, I mean, as journalists we shouldn't campaign, but specifically, what are some of the things cropping up that we should be aware of, that we should cover?
Well, I think it is that the fact that climate change, loss of biodiversity, and land degradation are not just environmental issues, they are developmental, economic, social, moral, security, and ethical, and that these issues affect every human being on our planet. And we all have to recognize, if we want a sustainable future, these are the options we've got. And there's a very fine line between being advocates and actually just sort of sitting passively behind. So we're not allowed to be, and we should not be, prescriptive or normative in our international assessments. So we shouldn't tell governments what to do. We shouldn't tell the private sector what. But what we can say is, if you want to achieve the following goal, these are your 2 or 3 options. If you want to avoid this future, these are your 2 or 3 options. So we're not saying you must do this and this, but we say if you want to do the following, and that journalism can do the same. You can say, the world has said we need a 1.52 degree world. Then from a journalism, this is what the evidence is. This is what you governments, this is what you private sector, this is what you as individuals can do to achieve that world. So there's a fine line between just using knowledge for informed decision making versus being just outright advocates.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for your passion.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Lauriane Trimoula. I'm a communications person. It's more of a comment because the previous question was quite similar. But you say that ministers of environment got the message. But then when you see in France, where I come from, that people such as Nicolas Hulot resigned because the lobbies are so powerful, then what can you do? What's your reaction?
Yes, thank you very much. A very good point. The normal agencies that come to IPBES, for example, are indeed from environment agencies or sometimes from foreign service departments. We need to get this message to the agriculture minister, the energy minister, the transportation minister, actually the finance minister, even more important. We've got a huge challenge. What I believe is every country in the world should put together a national committee for biodiversity and climate change and the UN Sustainable Development Goals that would have different government departments working together. It would have private sector entities and representatives of civil society, because this is far more than environment ministers. It's all the other ministers. I would say we have a long way to go to get our message to those ministers, but that's the challenge. And also by you guys talking about these issues and pointing out they're not simply environmental issues. The Minister for Energy and Agri probably read your newspapers, hopefully, or listen to your radio, or listen to the television, or look at social media. So you can play a role to get beyond the environment ministers.
You, sir.
Thank you. Marcus Strom from Australia, where I think Parliament today just voted to welcome a brand new coal mine run by Adani. We just had an election where the people who promote coal won. So I welcome your enthusiasm and optimism, given, and also Australia is losing more mammals than any other continent at the moment. So things are not rosy there. What I want to ask is, what role do you think in terms of civil society outside of government do movements like Extinction Rebellion and these movements that are growing up, what role do they play? Do they have to offer?
They clearly have a role. We need to use every tool in our box. The scientists have to speak, the media has to speak, these rebellion movements have to speak. In Australia, absolutely right, a very conservative government. Against all odds, we thought that there would be a change in government, but we're seeing right-wing governments in the US, Brazil, Hungary, Australia. They tend to, these conservative governments, not to care appropriately about the environment. But the point is they're looking at them as environmental issues. They're not looking at them as the economic issues, development issues. Not only are you losing mammals, the Great Barrier Reef is clearly, in many parts of it, not all of it, in trouble. That's a major source of income, tourism for Australia. I really have had a hard time understanding Australia, and I spent 3 years, just 8 weeks each year. working in Australia on sustainable development, basically, issues, both social, environmental, and economic, basically. And, you know, the recent governments have indeed turned a complete blind eye to climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. It, just like the US and a few other countries, it is a real missed opportunity. All I can say is we need to keep the pressure on these governments and to persuade them that they're missing an opportunity to be more economically powerful, etc. So all we can do is keep talking with them, encourage them to let them rethink what the evidence is.
Okay, so we're running out of time, so we'll take these two, I hope, short questions, but good ones.
Okay. The other day in the conversation, you said that this time the media was actually paying attention, and you attributed that to the thing that you came up with this great line with 1 million species are going to be lost. What is your strategy for the future? Because now that you find that this is the way, not only appealing to science journalists, but to all journalists, do you have a strategy in communication for that?
Well, our communications director for IPBES is sitting in the front row, Rob Spall. Yes, we've got to keep pressure on through all ways we can connect with people, that's governments, private sector, and the people at large, basically. So it's giving talks like this, it's getting the media to respond. There is a huge meeting coming up in China next year, where governments around the world will indeed look to see what should the biodiversity targets look like post-2020. There's a big meeting on climate change coming up next year that'll be in the UK. I think both sets of conventions will look at the interplay between climate and biodiversity. I think a key to success is really trying to move forward with the private sector. They recognise at the last Davos meeting that biodiversity and climate change are important issues for the private sector. So we just need to keep the conversation going, and the media play a very important role. And you're right, our headline, 1 million species at risk, was catchy, and that did indeed catch the image. But underneath those stories, you did all talk about food security, water security, the loss of our forests, the loss of our coral reefs. So just keep following us, and between us, between the science community and you guys, we can all make a difference.
Okay, the
Thanks
last
very,
question.
thanks very much, Bob. Natasha Mitchell from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, another Australian. I guess this is a rather vexed issue for us. You know, I am interested, though, in pushing you a little further on that question of maintaining the conversation. When you have a situation in many nation states now where leadership is being turned over to populist agendas, to hubristic megalomaniacs, to people who are driven by domestic political agendas and who just will not engage in that conversation. You know, they're not about globalism or a global exchange or collaboration. So I'd love to press you further on that. And also, can you imagine a world without humans?
No, I can't, and I don't think we'll ever get to that point. I think humans, luckily, are intelligent enough. They'll go to the edge of the precipice or the cliff and pull back, basically. I'm actually, with even reasonable policies, technologies, and individual actions, I do believe we can have a sustainable world that's economically vibrant and socially acceptable. But you're absolutely right. At this moment in time, having this sort of conversation with the White House would be impossible. Same with the current Australian government, basically. They don't want to listen to this message. But the power of the private sector, if we can convince the most powerful multinational companies, their power, the power of the private sector is, I could see the private sector in many countries leading governments. So we should not just keep talking to the governments. We need to really engage the private sector who do care about long-term profits. I think there is no dichotomy between long-term profits and sustainability, but it means doing things differently.
Well, that is a message for us. And with that, we end this. I give you my deepest thank you for your time and your knowledge.